So I was asked to speak on advancing clinical decision support, but I decided to change the title a little bit and talk about the evolution of clinical decision support. I've been at Cerner for 23 years, and I took the chance to work on these slides as a chance to step up, step back, and sort of see what's changed in the 20-some-odd years that I've been involved in building software. And I decided to follow this model of evolution. What I'm going to do is run through some very high-level observations about the patterns that I see happening in clinical decision support. It's a huge space, and I'll obviously only touch on little tiny pieces of it, but they're the things that jumped out at me. The good news at being at a great session like this is how many smart people are here. The bad news is that if you're the last one after a bunch of smart people, they've already covered a lot of your material. So some of this is going to go pretty fast because Bella in particular covered a good bit of what I was going to talk about. So hopefully that'll make it easier to follow. So on user experience, we've been talking about that all day, but at a high level, I think we've seen reactive, interrupting alerts replaced more by interactive alerts that are designed to assist you, and that in the future, where we're headed is ambient alerts that will attempt to guide you. And I'll show you some examples of these later, but I'm just going to run through the high-level thoughts at the first. In the knowledge representation, we've had good discussion in this current session about that. We started with scripts, pretty much if-then-else logic. We've migrated to rules where you could express more complicated constructs than could be easily captured in scripts. The current state of the art, I think, is algorithms driven by agents that look at large patterns of activity. And the future is big data, but big data only if it's really hooked to a learning model. Big data by itself may not be as interesting as we think it is. Knowledge source. Where does this knowledge come from that informs our clinical decision support? In the early days, and to some degree still common today, it's locally authored. It's built by the site that is deploying it. That has been supplemented in large measure in most recent implementations by knowledge that comes from the vendor. And that is migrating, as Bella described with the sepsis model, to the cloud. A lot of this knowledge is too complex to deploy locally, regardless of the mechanism that you do it, so it's better to deploy it from the cloud. We've seen discussion about the value of third-party content that can be imported according to a standard. That's what Bob just talked about. And then I'm going to talk at the end of this about what I think is the really interesting future is third-party that's integrated via plugins rather than just content, more of an app model than a content package model. Workflow integration. In the early days of decision support, it was mostly foreground integration, triggers that interrupted the current workflow. Then we saw the emergence of clinical event monitors that could monitor activity in the background and route an alert asynchronously to the clinician through an inbox or email or a page. And I think in the future we're going to see more network monitors where the actual multi-agent system is actually running in the cloud, looking at data that's broader than just what you have access to locally. We had in our evolution of the cloud-based sepsis model that Bella talked about earlier, one of the driving factors was that the close relative of a major Cerner executive died from sepsis during a transition from an emergency room to the hospital, and the critical time window to detect the sepsis was lost because she was in transit. The data had already been there in the emergency room, but that wasn't known when she got to the hospital. So there's a belief that in our shop that we need to have this data come across an entire network of sources, not just from the local EHR. How do we get at this data? We all started with ad hoc coding schemes, proprietary local coding schemes, and the curly brace problem, which pushed us all into writing our own procedural systems to access the knowledge. Arden was the precursor of how to capture some of that logic in the if-then-else part, but you were still left with the curly braces to get to the real data. That has been replaced in the current vision of ONC anyway with a combination of value sets, the virtual medical record, and event condition action rules, as Bob described with the healthy decisions work. Remains to be seen if this will be a successful approach or not. I'm going to cast some doubts on it as I go through the rest of this talk, but I'd say the jury is definitely out. We don't know yet, but it's a step above and beyond where we came from. And I think I'll put at the end a little proposal that maybe we ought to be thinking about clinical element models and FHIR as perhaps an alternative to the VMR and the event condition action set. So we'll have hopefully a few minutes to talk about that. What's the goal of the decision support? I think initially most of us wrote decision support that the goal was to stop harm. Then we migrated to guiding of therapy. I think the current state of the art is guiding both diagnosis and therapy. This is especially relevant in an era when it's not fee-for-service medicine anymore, and these expensive tests are changing every month with new genomic tests coming out that you can't keep track of. You need as much decision support on knowing how to work up the patient as you do in how to manage the patient. And then I think with the shift, the focus to population health, we'll see more and more decision support targeting the prevention of the problem in the first place. Obviously a holy grail of medicine, but we begin to have now data to at least try to some of these interventions, and maybe we'll have more success at this time. So now I'm going to shift and just do a few screenshots from stuff that we've done, apropos not necessarily of anything, but just to have some to show. This is a adverse drug event alert from the bad old days when we popped up an interactive alert and put so much information on the screen that no one could possibly assimilate it in the process of actual care. How do we avoid this? Well, one thing we worked on a little bit more recently was an e-prescribing application that pre-screened all of the drug choices so that before you click on the order, you're given some information about the payer's preference, the likelihood that there's a drug interaction alert, so that if you see those triple exclaim marks, you can be pretty much guaranteed that you're going to get an alert if you pick that drug. So it's pretty easy with a little bit of training to scan this list and say, this drug is not only preferred by the payer, it's actually not going to generate an alert. And it's couched in guidance for the actual disease. So it's a little bit of embedding guidance and pre-screening of alerts. I think where we're headed, I'll skip that one, is more of these interactive alerts where the alert engages you in a conversation. This is one that we've deployed at a lot of Cerner sites that's for VTE prophylaxis, and it's a multi-page form. It's a lot of data being captured. If the EHR already knows the data, it doesn't ask you to recapture it, but if it doesn't know it and it needs to know it to make a rational decision, it walks you through this conversation. It's not the best usability in the world yet, but it's a step in that direction. Where we're headed is what I like to call ambient guidance, where you carry out your workflow on the left-hand side of the page, and then on the right-hand side of the page in a bar are things that come in and out of focus depending upon what you're doing that may offer value to you. Now this is design work. This isn't deployed in the field yet, but that right-hand bar consists essentially of pluggable modules that can be tied to the context of what you're doing and to the current patient, and can do things such as, for example, rendering a differential diagnosis with the Isabel engine, or bringing a clinical trial recruiting alert to the surface if this patient qualifies as a clinical trial. And we're designing these to be pluggable so that we can, in fact, integrate third-party systems into that workflow. Bella did a wonderful job of describing sepsis, our sepsis algorithm, which moves the data to the cloud, and she had much better pictures than I do. I'm going to have to get a copy of that really beautiful slide she had. But this is the non-artistic interpretation of what we're doing there, which is we crawl the data in the EHR for the subset of lab results and mental status activity that is relevant to sepsis. We extract it, map it, store it in a population-centric EHR, and then a Blackboard system is monitoring that for a number of things, but one of which is the sepsis criteria having been met. And then that data is routed back down to the user, initially in the form of alerts, but what we've come to discover is that it's really better to route it to a team and to use it to sort the list of acutely sick patients, so that you're not actually telling anybody anything other than this patient has risen to the top of the list of really sick patients and you should be monitoring them. And in some cases they already are, so you avoid the nuisance alert effect. But the logic for this, what was interesting to me, is we went through, I think we're now up to 16 versions of the logic of the algorithm, and we were able to rapidly evolve that logic because we had hundreds of clients participating, sending data in, and then reviewing the data and the sensitivity and specificity. And we've made numerous adjustments to the algorithm. So I call it cloud. It's cloud-based, but it's crowdsourced in the sense that the crowd of our participatory clients were able to make this a better alert. we can make those changes without bothering anybody. The alert gets better. Nobody has to install local software. And we had similar experience with using cloud-based sources for some of the traditional predictive analytic models where you take a broader swath of data into account. You can improve the sensitivity and the specificity. In this case, an all-cause readmission score that we jointly developed with Advocate in Chicago and got much better scores than were possible with just EHR data alone, not surprisingly. Now, this is what I'd like to leave you with as what I'm personally excited about. It's what I'm working on, so maybe this is a little bit of local bias. But we call it Smart on Fire, and this is a combination of one of the other SHARP grants, the SMART platform work done at Harvard Med, Boston Children's, Regan Streif, and a number of others. I think some of you may have participated in some of the SMART platform work, combined with FIRE, which is a new standard emerging from HL7, which is really exciting to see some really powerful, useful stuff coming out of HL7. They've been kind of wandering in the desert of version 3 for a long time, and we've now got some pretty exciting stuff coming. And what we did, and we demonstrated this at HIMSS, so it's very early work, just a few months old, but we got a number of vendors or data providers there on the bottom to agree to implement a subset of FIRE using clinical profiles derived from Stan Huff's clinical element modeling work at Intermountain, and then serve them up to app creators. We took 6 apps, 3 of which were from open source Boston Children's, 3 of which were commercial products that had been deployed as web products, but we wrapped them as apps and deployed them against Millennium. And I wanted to make the point that, and it worked pretty well. It was actually pretty easy to get the apps reconfigured to be smart aware, and the FIRE constructs are easy for programmers to understand, so they grok that in a hurry. And what my point is, here's a little bit of an aside on what a FIRE resource looks like. This is an observation. Anybody who knows HL7 will recognize some common themes, but that's it. The whole observation is just that snippet of XML. It's not too complicated. These observations need to be profiled to tell you how to use them in a particular use case. So if you want to send a blood pressure, which is 2 observations, you need to have some way to agree how you're going to send those 2 observations linked together, so you wrap them inside of a list observation. Those are the kind of semantic interoperability problems that can be reduced to what I call semantics by contract, where the profile is the contract of how the semantics of your service is going to behave. So if we have a broad set of profiles, the semantics by contract, then developing apps that can plug in is actually very quick and easy to do. So this is a clinical decision type app. This is a visualization of neonatal risk of hyperbilirubinemia that was developed on the HELP system at Intermountain. They took that work from the HELP system and quickly rewrapped it as a smart plug-in. So it's pulling the data out of Millennium. This is Millennium's power chart frame here on the outside, displaying that for the clinicians. Here's a third-party app from a company called Visual Diagnosis that some of you probably have experimented with. What we're pulling out of Millennium when you first launch it is the current diagnosis list of the patient along with the drugs that they are currently on. And the clinician can dive into the Visual Diagnosis app following a notion or a hunch about a specific cause for a finding that they want help with. So in this case, looking at tuberculosis and reviewing whether the chest x-ray fits the pattern that they're seeing in this patient. So this is pluggable decision support. Now, these could be hooked to triggers. I showed them in ad hoc mode where you would invoke them on your own. So in the remaining 1 minute, summarizing, ambient is better than interruptive. Guidance is better than interdiction. Cloud-based deployment is better than local. Big learning is better than just big data. Community and population data is going to trump local data if that's your choice. Algorithmic and multi-agent logic or knowledge will be better and more powerful than scripts or rules alone. We're going to be forced to deal with the fact that our patients are all comorbid, and this is really hard with the cursive dimensionality, but multi-disease logic is going to have to trump single disease at a time logic. And then I think pluggable apps will be better than imported rule sets. And to be provocative so that Joe has something to worry about, I'll suggest that SMART and FIRE and clinical element models may be a better or more broad approach than just the CDSS model of HL7 and the VMR for data encoding.